This is the only evidence that the police gathered at the scene where Scott Young, a multimillionaire property tycoon, fell to his death in 2014. The police said it was suicide, but they didn't even dust for fingerprints or perform basic tests on the blood-drenched clothes that he was wearing when he fell. But now we have evidence connecting Scott's death to a ring of suspected Russian assassinations in Britain, and sources say the government is turning a blind eye. Scott Young was a multi-millionaire property dealer living a double life. We've discovered he was doing secret deals for the exiled Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky, had organised crime connections, and was being watched by Vladimir Putin's spies. But on the face of it, he was the perfect family man.
And you know, the humour in particular, he was so funny, and I think that's what I fell in love with. I introduced him to my parents, they fell in love with him, most people did, you know, and that's why I suppose it's really hard for me to remember those, because he betrayed us so much.
These are the railings where Scott Young was impaled through the heart after falling from the 4th floor of this townhouse on a cold December night in 2014. There was no one here to see it, and the impact killed him instantly.
He'd been found impaled on railings, and he'd committed suicide. And I knew as soon as I had received that phone call, I knew that he'd been murdered.
This is the window Scott fell from. He was a big man with a crippling fear of heights. Police said he must have dived out head first to land where he did. The officers said there was no sign of a struggle, but Scott's daughters later found these mysterious scratch marks on the windowsill. And how did Scott jump out of here without knocking over this Coke can, lighter, and cigarette packet? BuzzFeed's investigations team has been looking into Scott's death for 2 years. We've obtained a cache of millions of pages of evidence that document his shadowy business dealings in Russia. And at the centre of it all is Project Moscow. This was a major property development in central Moscow that promised to yield profits of hundreds of millions of pounds. Scott went halves on the deal with a group of Russian financiers, but it turned sour when funds ran dry and the Moscow police went after the investors for economic crimes. Lurking behind the scheme was a man named Boris Berezovsky, Russia's public enemy number one. The exiled oligarch was a fierce opponent of Vladimir Putin, and he'd been the target of several assassination plots since fleeing to Britain in 2000. He was strictly forbidden from doing business in Russia. But these documents reveal that Berezovsky was secretly funneling money into Project Moscow, and Scott was acting as a front.
I was very concerned when I realised he was actually very involved with Boris Berezovsky. I said to him, I'm concerned, you know, for your safety and the safety of our 2 daughters. You know, these are dangerous people. But
by now, Scott was already deeply involved with Berezovsky, and the Russian government knew about it.
I had an intelligence report commissioned, and within this intelligence report, it had information showing that Scott was being followed by the Russian intelligence service, and that was due to the fact he was doing business with Boris Berezovsky and other major Russian oligarchs.
The intelligence report states that Russian spies had been following Scott during his Moscow visits since 2002, and the Russian government approached Michelle to ask for evidence about her ex-husband.
Around 2012, I was approached by senior people within the Russian government who arranged for me to travel to Russia, to Moscow, and they had files on Scott Young and Boris Berezovsky.
The following year, Berezovsky was found hanged at his Ascot mansion. The coroner couldn't decide whether it was suicide or murder.
I had a phone call from someone who was actually working with the Russian government to say that Boris Berezovsky was being dealt with and would end up in a body bag.
Berezovsky was at the centre of a group of 9 close friends and associates, including Scott, who died mysteriously. Police and hospital records show that Scott lived in constant fear of Russian assassins following the collapse of Project Moscow. He was so scared that friends say he sought protection from the Addams family, one of the UK's most notorious crime gangs. No one will ever know exactly what happened the night Scott fell, but we can now reveal that American spy agencies have classified intelligence suggesting his death may be linked to Russia. Scott, Berezovsky, and others in their circle are among 14 people high-ranking US and UK intelligence sources say may have been assassinated by either the Kremlin or the Russian mafia. US spies have told us that the UK is ignoring the threat to protect the flow of Russian money into Britain, and that leaves 14 families without answers.
I think it's a major cover-up. I think it's politically connected, and there's a lot of people that have blood on their hands.